How do I actually, there it comes. So, funny thing, I looked at the program this morning and realized that, totally my fault, I have basically submitted 2 different titles and then picked the wrong one. But it is not such a big problem, because when I picked these titles, I hadn't put together the talk anyway, so what you get is basically what I can give you. So I will talk about Bell Beaker paradigms, the relations of concepts and data. Basically, it will be about what we actually could understand about or behind the term Bell Beaker phenomenon, or all these different other terms that have been used over the time or are still used, the Bell Beaker culture, Beaker fork complex, and so on. I especially like the Bell Beaker practicing individuals, or not on this list, van der Linden's Bell Beaker mess. I think this is something that describes the thing very well. Short outline of my talk here. I will first discuss the question of reification, which I still think is a main problem in how we think about cordetware and Bell Beakers and the whole of the 3rd millennium, actually. I will secondly talk about the delineation of these different groups and discuss the possibility of a polythetic approach to the 3rd millennium. I will then discuss the narratives, or maybe the dominant narrative, social narrative connected to Bell Beakers, as it has emerged especially after the impact of DNA data. And I will especially concentrate on 3 points here: patriarchy, or gender relations in general, the question of the massiveness of migration, and the question of male warriorhood, something we already heard about. And in the end, I will lament the lack of politics in our interpretation. I do not mean the lack of current politics, but I mean the lack of an idea about politics, how it unfolded in the past. Okay, so what is the Bell Beaker phenomenon? I think clearly it is, first of all, an archaeological unit of classification. And I do believe, as I just mentioned, that reification, so the idea that anything that we have defined here as archaeologists through archaeological finds in the present, this actually is a real thing, or was a real thing, a real social phenomenon in the past, is something that is problematic when we are thinking about the 3rd millennium. So it is about the relation between archaeological units and prehistoric social realities, as it is reflected in these terms as Beaker communities, Beaker folk, and so on and so forth. The underlying problem is, I think, that we have a mixing of material classification and social interpretation. We are, much too often at least, thinking or using the premise that one archaeological unit basically must have one corresponding social unit, or that at least can be explained by one factor, social or natural factor. It is actually something that is deep-seated in archaeology, and it is a kind of flaw that we inherited from our culture-historical past, or our culture-historical present, if you want. So it's basically replicating Gustav Cosina's main error, namely to mistake the presence of similar material culture traits as a sign of similar, or at least strongly connected, social phenomena. So the idea that a beaker is a beaker, so that things that look the same actually also means the same. It's basically an inadequate semiotic model. It's a misunderstanding, I would argue, of the Saussurean semiotic model, this dyad of sign and signified, of meaning, and the carrier of signs. This is something where one tends to, I mean, if one uses this model, one tends to assume that there is a kind of stable relationship between a sign and its meaning. I think it's much more useful to choose this kind of pragmatist alternative, Charles Sanders Peirce, that has been suggested by Purcell, Knappett, and others, I think, where signification processes are not seen as this kind of dyadic relationship between a sign and its meaning, but rather there's a third pole, the interpretant, which basically represent the act of sign interpretation, which takes place in the real world and has to do with the specific practices and cultural, social context in which it happens. This heavily influences how we perceive things and the meaning we ascribe to things. And I think such a kind of change of a semiotic model really also in archaeology has had its effect and has led to a change of perspective from the kind of culture historian focus on the formal similarity of things, so this kind of typologizing of pots and the decoration and so forth, which was then used to imply this kind of common meaning and to look at these Bell Beakers and other material culture sets as uniform social phenomena. This is the kind of cultural historical tradition, and I think at least with post-processualism, it moved on to this more contextual perspective where things were tried to be understood in their specific social, local, or regional contexts, which then, of course, always would add meaning to and actually give meaning to these different things. This is probably not really new. I mean, I think already 40 years ago, more or less, with Stephen Shannon talked about the same things, and I think this idea of a beaker package, which is a set of material objects that is very differently or placed in very different social context, is basically addressing everything I just said. But I still think it's important to point out these things because they're still somehow biasing some of our interpretations in archaeology. The same way then 30 years later, also Mark van der Linden has pointed out this kind of variability of this Bell Beaker mess and also applied a polythetic classification of the whole material complex. Come to the second point, the delineation of the Bell Beaker phenomenon, delineation that I would also like to approach in a polythetic sense. This is a map that is more or less representing this kind of monothetic view where we have our cordetware, Bell Beakers. Although they're overlapping, they're still seen as two separate units. If we look at the burial rituals, which especially where I work in Central Europe is the main source of our Bell Beakers and our knowledge about Bell Beakers, and it's even not only something that where we find our Bell Beakers, but it's also something that is used as a definitional tool, or it's used to define what the Bell Beaker phenomenon in Central Europe actually is. There is a kind of textbook version of the third millennium in Europe, which I, for example, also tell the students, at least in the introductory course, to get the first patterns right, or maybe wrong, that there is this kind of cordetware burial rite and Bell Beaker burial rite, which have specific traits, specific rules, and they do have certain overall features like gender differentiation and orientation rules and all these things. But they are also clearly opposed to each other through specific orientation differences. However, I think everybody here in the room is clearly aware there is no such thing as a Bell Beaker burial rite if one looks at the overall picture. This kind of textbook version of Bell Beakers that we learn here in Germany, for example, is something that is more or less constrained to Central Europe, more or less, and there is a kind of maybe abbreviated textbook version in the Netherlands and the British Isles and also in Hungary. But the whole of the west and south of the Bell Beaker distribution area is a totally different world when it comes to burial rites. And in the same way, with cordetware, we have this phenomenon, this really, let's say, this textbook cordetware, west-east, and so on, binary gender orientation, textbook version is only really regularly present in some of these regions that I've marked in green here, while in other regions you have strong deviations. Even you have totally different burial rituals or no burials at all. Or in some regions you cannot really account for some of these elements that are supposedly part of the textbook versions. And in some regions you are really you don't only have single deviations, but you have regular deviations where the orientation, for example, is north-south very much and very close. It then comes to this Bell Beaker version. And this is why I, 2019, argued that if you look at the material from the third millennium in a polythetic manner, and you look at the burial rituals at one side and different styles of material culture on the other side, you don't really end up with a Bell Beaker burial rite and a cordetware burial rite, but you end up with basically one new burial custom, which basically is a variation or a set of variations over a basic theme, and this basic theme is that we're dealing here with single burials, sometimes under burial mounds, sometimes not. We are dealing here with specific orientation rules, which are sometimes observed, not observed, but sometimes also have then different directions. We are dealing sometimes with binary gender roles in these burials and sometimes not. We are dealing with weapons of different kinds in male burials mainly, and we are dealing with drinking vessels of different kinds, be it the Garda beaker or the Bell beaker, or also later in the early Bronze Age kind of cups, Bronze Age cups, which are very prominent. I called this late Neolithic, early Bronze Age single grave burial rite, SGBR or something like this. For brevity, I call it now single grave burial rite or something like this. If you apply this polythetic view of the third millennium, you end up with this. At around 2900, what appears in Central Europe is basically a new burial complex, newly formed in Central Europe, but of course inspired, maybe strongly inspired by elements of Eastern European kurgan traditions, including in its later phase, Yamnaya. Sometime later, there is this discussion about an early pottery-less cordware burial horizon, for example. At least more or less at the same time, maybe, there is these new single grave burial customs are accompanied by cordware material culture for some time in some regions. But at the same time, cordware material culture is also appearing in regions where you have no or very few of these kind of burials, where they're found mainly in settlements or they're found in megaliths or in other places. After 2500, this burial ritual in its variations is then also connected to bell beakers, something that might have a pottery style that might have developed in southwestern Europe and somehow brought in. And in the course of this, the new combination of bell beakers and this new burial rite is translated also or transferred into Britain. But again, as we all know, bell beakers are also found again clearly outside of the realm of this burial ritual. So what we have here is a newly formed burial custom with affinities to the step that is successively and at times, sometimes also not connected to different style of material culture. What is important here is that it is especially this new burial rite that has the strongest connection to the genetic step ancestry. In this recent article by Wolfgang Haag and colleagues, it was possible to show, if you look here at this PCA of all the available or then available cordware burials, what you can see is that there is a part of cordware burials up here that are standing out as being more closely connected to steppe population than others. Others here further down are well, more similar to the more general late Neolithic, early Bronze Age populations at the time. So a little more blurred, less clearly connected to the steppe genetic influence. And here is also this kind of zooming in of this PCA. And what you can see is that it is especially those individuals up here that are found really in these single graves that are most clearly standing out as having steppe ancestry, while those which are more, like the general population at the period, they are associated to cordware mostly by material culture and not so much by this new burial ritual. And this is something, of course, that is well known in the Bell Beaker case. It was clearly, I think, shown by Olalde in the Olalde paper in 2018 that it is those regions here where we have this kind of textbook-like Bell Beaker burial rituals which have the clearest impact of steppe ancestry, while in those regions where we do not regularly find this kind of burial rite, we don't have so much or a much later occurrence of this steppe ancestry. And even if you go into the individual graves, you do find that this correlation also still holds on the individual level, more or less. So I think this is a clear pattern. So this is basically the clue of this polythetic classification. Genetic steppe ancestry is not primarily connected to cordware or to bell beakers, but it is connected to these new specific burial customs. That also, of course, means that we are probably dealing here, and it's also been formulated by several people already, we're probably dealing here with a kind of a possible sample bias, because these kind of individual burials in nicely preserved skeletons is, of course, something that geneticists are going after and for DNA analysis. And it probably means that other burial rituals that are less archaeologically visible and also have less well-preserved bones will probably not show up, at least so fast, in the genetic record. So it might misrepresent the speed of genetic change, something that I will come back to later. Okay, the next point I wanted to talk about is how all these developments of new burial rituals and new material culture styles have served to create a specific narrative about the third millennium. First of all, I think it makes a total sense to say that those elements of this new burial rite do actually present or display some social values that might have not been as marked in earlier periods of the Neolithic. So the individual, for example, binary gender roles, new social roles such as the warrior, weapons and violence, maybe new forms of cosmology, religion maybe even, or new social practices like alcoholic beverage or drinking of alcohol and so on. This has been somehow shaped into what I call the dominant narrative. Maybe strawmanning a little here, but I think now we can discuss about this. This dominant narrative says that there is this kind of epochal transformation from a Neolithic society to a Bronze Age society, which feature or is brought by a massive migration and a massive population turnover. The kind of traditional or the local or non-migrant Neolithic population is more or less seen as backwards and also somehow relatively fast wiped away from history. And new ideological and social patterns are somehow transplanted into Europe, into Central Europe, and then later Western Europe through this act of migration. And these new patterns, they have to do with the male warrior as the main and active migrant, while women are portrayed as passive, rather marginalized as captives or as being handed around as marriage partners. Patriarchic family structures are often proposed, and top-down chiefdom-like social organization and so on. And of course, at least in the popular imagination, there is this kind of genocidal process going on, which has to do with this kind of fast population turnover. This is why I want to discuss at least three of those main pillars of this narrative. First is patriarchy, second, the massiveness of migration, and third, this male warriorhood trope, something we already talked about. Okay, with patriarchy, it's relatively brief to talk about this. The idea of third millennium being the start of a patriarchic society is mostly based on the finding of patrilocality when it comes to the study of strontium isotopes, or also the difference or the comparison of Y chromosome and mtDNA haplotypes, indicating that women are more mobile than men. And thus, this is taken as a kind of indication for patrilocal marriage patterns. However, I think this has three main problems. First of all, there seems to be a kind of low threshold for confirmation of patrilocality. So you don't need a huge number of more mobile women than men in order to postulate that you have found patrilocality. Also, I think the whole question that is being pursued in most of these papers is a very narrow. It basically is, does patrilocality exist? And this is then usually confirmed. As Enzo, for example, has pointed out in anthropology, there is a lot of, more than one or two variants of marriage locations or marriage patterns. And we would actually need a much more, as he also showed in his recent book, we need a much broader set of questions and set of indicators in order to talk about marriage rules to reconstruct for the third millennium. And of course, thirdly, as Kate Freeman and colleagues have also argued, patrilocality, of course, does not at all indicate patriarchy. So this is a kind of not so well argued connection of marriage pattern with a kind of social structure or power relations within the family or within society at large. Then, of course, one also has to say that the study, I think we discussed about this before already today, the discussion about female identities, female grave equipments, and all these things is actually, well, inexcusably neglected so far, I think, and there's just a few exceptions. Freeman, of course, already that, as I mentioned, but also Olerud, for example. But all in all, in the models, the women are really not playing such a big role. They are passive, they are captives, they are marriage partners being handed around, and I think there's a lot more to explore when it comes to narratives of the third millennium, when it comes to gender relations. Second point I want to talk about is the idea of an extraordinary fast population turnover. This is something that, of course, was famously put in the headline of Wolfgang's founding paper that started this whole discussion. Our genetic data provide direct evidence of migration and suggest that it was relatively sudden. I think absolutely clear and true. The question, of course, is what relatively sudden means in an archaeological sense. Here it is a few centuries. Of course, when you see graphs like this is the British case. The same was argued for the Iberian Peninsula. But it is very clear that you have a clear genetic turnover from the Neolithic to the Chalcolithic, or the period when beakers start to appear. And this is actually, taking a few centuries. Right? It's not clear how fast it goes. If we think about what I argued a little earlier, that we have, of course, a specific kind of burial custom that might be socially and also genetically selective, then it could be discussed how sudden we are really talking about. But let's say it's 300 years, then it's very fast. This idea of a genocide, of genocidal, wiping out of the local populations has been suggested. I mean, it has been suggested by colleagues, but I think not really in these in scientific publication. It's more in the communication to the public. For me, I would like to see more mass graves and more signs of massive violence. I mean, there's Košice, of course, famously. There's Eulau, a few others. But that's not enough for me to explain this kind of such a population wipe out. Systematic assessments of rates of violence on skeletons have not found an uptick or really a significant change from towards the Bell Beaker period or the third millennium as such. Parker Pearson has done this. It has been done for continental Europe, for Germany here, and they all do not really support the idea that there is this kind of genocide on a massive scale. But I also don't really think we need this at all. Thinking about 300 years, I think what is usually underestimated is what the possible effects of differential population growth could actually be, because one tends to underestimate the exponential nature of population growth. These are some numbers put together with different annual growth rates, which are all from the spectrum of historical times. And I think it is clear that you can come within 300 years, you can come from a population of 100 to like 3 million. So that's a lot. That is definitely enough to explain how a massive population turnover could happen without genocide, without any kind of even marked change that would be visible to people back in the days. So I think an alternative model to this kind of massive migration, taking all these things into account, would be to think about maybe to step away from the idea of, immobile, socially fixed communities in the Neolithic as a kind of standard, as opposed to a very sudden, massive migration. I very much subscribes, again, Mike Parker Pearson has shown that basically you have something like a baseline mobility within prehistory, probably, definitely in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, where you have a high percentage of individuals regularly being non-local. That means changing their place of life. So this kind of idea of fixed communities is something that is not consistent with the data. The same is true for different places in Europe at different times. Whenever DNA or isotope studies target specific communities or like sites of settlement sites, grave sites, what they find is a high degree of non-locals. So they find open, fluid communities to be the typical feature of European Neolithic settlements. Something that's not really so surprising, but it is somehow not really featuring in our models about social change. So this could be marriage networks, of course. It could be other forms of population circulation. But if we have such a baseline mobility during the Neolithic, I would think that if we think on the large scale, after the Neolithization of Europe, what you have is then basically 3,000 years of constant intermixture within ecological zones like your temperate Europe, the steppes, Middle East, and others, where people are mostly mixing themselves up within these regions. And it is basic, and then they are creating these kind of ancestries, the Neolithic, European Neolithic ancestry and so forth, that we reconstruct in our, that we find genetically. And it's only when these boundaries, the ecological boundaries or these population boundaries are at one point crossed, that suddenly a new signal shows up in the genetic record. This is, so for whatever reasons, this is the spark that maybe happened in 3000 BC, and maybe due to a higher resistance towards Yersinia pestis or whatever was roaming around, you would have a higher survival rate, higher population growth rate in the migrant population than in the other population, and after 300 years, you have a total population turnover. Right. The last point I want to discuss here is the male warrior paradigm. This is one that's probably the most commonly accepted, probably due to the prevalence of shaft hole axes in male corded burials, or this dagger, bow, and arrow set in the Bell Beakers. We have already heard it from Carsten. To challenge this topic, I think, with real data shows that it's not totally wrong, but I think it needs a lot of differentiation. For example, in the Yamnaya burials, very contrary to this stereotypic Yamnaya male warrior from the internet, most of the Yamnaya graves don't contain any weapons. Corded ware, of course, axes are abundant, but first of all, they don't really seem to be the most effective of all weapons, and as we have seen from Carsten, they are not always used as weapons. When it comes to the beakers, the Bell Beaker set, it is not entirely clear if those were maybe displaying a set of hunting equipment, or maybe, as we've just heard, travelers' equipments. And definitely what also has been shown is that there is really no connection between archery displayed in burials and the actual archery practice, both in useware and osteological analysis. This all is also to be seen in a large historical context. The kind of prevalence of warriors, of fighting, of weapons, is something that has not always been in human history, but something that clearly springs up in the 4th millennium BC, as Roberto Rich has shown here. It is so these kind of depictions of weapons and fighting, humans fighting other humans, is something that only appears around the middle of the 4th millennium BC, and it takes up speed and gets more frequent in the 3rd millennium. In the same way, Jeunesse and Schuldrich and others have shown that you have, for example, a clear uptick in shaft hole axes in pre-corded ware, so late 4th millennium burials already, indicating that there is an overall trend going on of more importance of violence and male warriorhood. Probably we can go even larger out and see that this is something that might have its clearest expression in the Middle East, in the urbanization and state formation processes, 5th, 4th millennium. So this is a huge kind of context, but probably important. In some of these early Mesopotamian urban centers, what we see is a kind of new scale of violence, kind of military style of violence, where we have socially disembedded forms of violence, really at a scale of hundreds being killed, such as in Tel Brak, around 3,800. Hemblin talked about crossing the military threshold during the late Uruk, which would be a little later, but overall, this is the time period actually preceding our 3rd millennium developments, where we see this incoming of violence and so on. So domination in these early state communities. Domination and coercion is something that I think must have massively transformed social relations and must have led to, or probably has led to, the prevalence of all this kind of armed individual as becoming a new social value, not only in those in the center of those developments, but especially also on the margins, because they were often probably at the receiving end of these kind of new forms of armed conflict. But these, and that's important, I think, are trends emerging super regionally and many centuries before all those developments in the third millennium happened. So these kind of new ideas, they were roaming around. They were not brought by migrants from the east to Europe, but they were roaming around in the larger region. And also, a social value displayed in burial customs, as we have just seen, does not necessarily portray social reality. I think to understand the kind of ambivalence between the data and the kind of presence or not presence, or like ambivalent presence of certain values and new social roles, what is missing is a sense of politics in the past. I think I would argue that we tend to think about prehistoric people a little like we tended to think about non-European people in the past, people without history, people without politics. So we think about past as people that are unable of pursuing or negotiating their own interests and solving conflicts in a self-conscious way as political actors, while we tend to explain changes by adaptation, demography, climate change, or migration, as in this case. Politics, if at all, mostly implicit, is showing up when it comes to somehow clashes between groups of people who are seen as internally coherent with leaders or elites who are then the politicians, so to say. How I would like to see politics, that's rather, as in the forthcoming book by Dani Hoffmann and others, including me, we think about politics basically as the negotiation of diverse interests and possibilities of decision-making at all social scales, from the individual to the small group, family, household, settlement, and so on. And we would argue that in situations of migration, like in all other situations, there will, of course, have been several encounters of local and trans-regional values and value systems which need to be negotiated and needs to come to a resolution. I think this is how, if you think about politics, this is how we can explain how the new burial rituals, how the cordetware, Bell Beaker, or Yamnaya material culture sets are actually so differently integrated in different parts of Europe, because they are transformed, they are rejected, negotiated in different ways. So when the Amesbury archer came to England, he would have told his own story about what Bell Beakers means, and he might have met quite different reactions depending on the historically specific circumstances that he was coming to, and the same would be the case somewhere else. The thick-headed Dutch farmer who have this new axe would, of course, have put it to a more practical use, even if it still, in the end, ended up in a burial. So this is how we have all these kind of differences between Bell Beakers in Germany and Portugal and Britain and so on, everything looking quite a mess. The same with cordetware, of course, which really sees integration of very, very different communities using or not using several elements or all elements of this new package. So I would say, concluding here, that Bell Beakers, but also cordetware, Yamnaya, they're not distinct, they're not representing distinct social phenomena, but they are rather summary terms, artificially created summary terms, for a lot of different outcomes of local political struggles, which include either full or selective integration or certain forms of transformation or even rejection of these kind of new values that were floating around at the time. So to understand third millennium transformations, I would like to first question and critically discuss our use of modern concepts in the construction of our narratives, and of course then propose that we should concentrate more on the politics of adaptation, integration, and also even resisting of these kind of trends and developments that we see overall coming into our archaeological record. Thank you very much. you.